April 1945. The air over the Rhineland is thick, not with the industrial smoke of a productive empire, but with the acrid, lingering haze of pulverized brick and charred timber. In a small, unnamed village nestled in the shadows of the Teutoburg forest, the silence is absolute, a heavy shroud that has replaced the rhythmic thrum of the local mill and the distant, frantic ringing of church bells. The cobblestone streets are choked with the skeletal remains of Wehrmacht trucks and the discarded helmets of boys who realized too late that the thousand-year Reich was expiring in the mud. The only movement comes from the flickering of small fires in the ruins and the occasional, cautious shifting of a curtain behind a cracked window pane. Deep within the damp darkness of stone cellars, the civilian population waits. These are the women, the elderly, and the children who have spent years listening to the sky scream. Their hands are calloused and gray, their stomachs hollowed by months of ersatz rations, bread stretched with sawdust and potatoes harvested from frozen fields. They have been told for years that the Americans were a soft, mongrel people, a nation of jazz-playing cowboys, who would crumble before the iron will of the Aryan spirit. They expected monsters or weaklings. They expected the end of the world. Then the sound begins. It is not the staccato clatter of horse-drawn carts or the frantic grinding of failing German engines. It is a low, rhythmic vibration that shakes the very foundations of the earth, the relentless mechanical heartbeat of the American logistical machine. Hundreds of olive-drab Studebaker trucks, jeeps, and Shermans begin to roll through the wreckage. These are not just weapons of war. They are the harbingers of a transformation that no amount of propaganda could survive. As the first columns of the U.S. Ninth Army grind to a halt in the village square, the cellar doors creak open. The German women emerge, blinking against the harsh spring light, their faces etched with a mixture of terror and profound exhaustion. They look at the American soldiers, who do not look like the starving, desperate men the Ministry of Public Enlightenment had described. Instead, they see young men with clear skin, sturdy boots, and an air of casual, almost bored, confidence. But it is not the soldiers' uniforms or their rifles that first capture the attention of the hungry watchers. It is something far more fundamental. Leaning against the side of a massive supply truck, a young private from Ohio reaches into a canvas bag. He pulls out a loaf of bread to share with his squad. To the American, it is a mundane staple of the field kitchen. To the German women watching from the shadows, it is an impossibility. It is not the dark, heavy, sour rye they have choked down for years. It is brilliant, impossibly white, and soft enough to bounce back when pressed. It carries a scent that cuts through the smell of cordite and rot, the sweet, yeasty aroma of a civilization that has never known true scarcity. In this moment, the first crack in the ideological wall of the Reich does not come from a shell, but from the sight of a simple, bleached flour ration. The contrast between the expected collapse of the West and the physical reality of American abundance is a psychological blow that will resonate far longer than the echoes of the artillery. To understand the tears of the women in the Rhineland, one must first look back at the grand, dark design of the hunger plan. Years earlier, the architects of the Third Reich had mapped out a future for Europe where German vitality was bought with the deliberate starvation of millions. It was a cold, calculated strategy. The occupied territories of the East would be bled dry of their grain, cattle, and fat, ensuring that no German kitchen would ever again feel the bite of the blockade that had broken the home front in 1918. For a time, the plan appeared to work. Trains laden with plundered Ukrainian wheat and French butter rolled into Berlin and Munich, creating a veneer of invincibility. The German table was a political statement, a symbol of a hierarchy where the master race feasted while the subhumans withered. However, as the tide of war turned and the Allied steel ring began to tighten, this stolen abundance evaporated. By 1944, the German domestic food supply was in a state of terminal decline. The systematic destruction of the rail networks and the loss of the fertile eastern plains meant that the German housewife was forced into a daily struggle for survival. The Nazi leadership, desperate to maintain morale, resorted to increasingly radical measures. They introduced the ersatz system, a triumph of chemistry over biology. Coffee was made from roasted acorns, sausages were filled with mysterious vegetable binders, and bread, the spiritual and physical anchor of the German diet, became a dark, dense brick of despair. It was often fortified with cellulose, a polite term for wood shavings, to provide bulk where there was no nutrition. The psychological toll was as heavy as the physical one. The Nazi ideology had promised a world of Germanic plenty, yet the reality was a return to the medieval. The propaganda ministers continued to scream about the plutocratic West and its supposed inner rot, claiming that the American economy was a fragile house of cards that would collapse under the strain of a real war. They told the German people that the Americans were a nation of waste and weakness, unable to endure the hardships that the disciplined German spirit could withstand. The German people were encouraged to take pride in their deprivation, to see their hunger as a badge of superior willpower. Yet, as the American divisions crossed the Rhine, the logistical reality of the United States became impossible to ignore. Unlike the German army, which still relied heavily on millions of horses and scavenged local supplies to move its men, the American force was an industrial ocean. For every American soldier on the front line, there were tons of supplies backing him up: fuel, ammunition, and, most importantly, food. The American logistical planners had determined that a soldier's morale was tied to the quality of his rations. They didn't just provide calories, they provided comfort. The appearance of the American supply train was the appearance of a society that could afford to fight a world war and still produce white bread of a quality that the average German had not seen in a decade. This was the historical context of the coming shock, the collision between a regime that weaponized starvation and a democracy that weaponized calories. The bread was not just food, it was the final undeniable evidence that the Nazi worldview was a lie. The propaganda of the master race had always been built upon the glorification of hardship and the stoicism of the German spirit. 4 years, Joseph Goebbels and the Ministry of Public Enlightenment had hammered a singular message into the psyche of the nation, that the German people were biologically and spiritually superior because they could endure what the decadent, luxury-obsessed West could not. This ideology demanded a complete rejection of comfort. In the Nazi worldview, the struggle for Lebensraum required a home front that viewed deprivation as a virtue. Every meal was a battle, and every missed luxury was a victory over the supposed softness of the democratic world. By early 1945, this virtuous hardship had devolved into a nightmare of ersatz living. The German housewife, once promised a modern kitchen in a sprawling estate in the conquered East, was instead reduced to a scavenger. The reality of the ersatz lifestyle was a gritty, gray existence. Bread, the foundation of every German meal, had become a chemical approximation of food. It was Kommissbrot, a dark, heavy, sour loaf that was increasingly composed of barley, potato flour, and even finely ground sawdust or wood flour to provide volume. It was a dense, indigestible mass that sat like a stone in the stomach, a physical manifestation of a regime that was literally consuming its own foundations. This ersatz culture extended to every facet of life. Coffee was a bitter infusion of chicory and acorns, soap was a gritty, abrasive block that refused to lather, and clothes were woven from zellwool, a wood-based rayon that offered no warmth against the biting winds of the final wartime winter. The German civilian was told to take pride in these victories of German science, yet the exhaustion was becoming terminal. The master race was gray-skinned, hollow-eyed, and perpetually cold. They had been promised the world, but they were being buried in the rubble of their own cities, clutching rations that barely sustained life. The contrast between this curated misery and the approaching American presence was about to become the ultimate psychological fracture. The Germans had been conditioned to believe that the Americans were a fragile, mongrel people who relied on machines and comforts because they lacked the inner steel of the German soldier. They expected to see a demoralized ragtag army of capitalists who would be terrified by the ruins of Europe. Instead, the civilians watching from behind their boarded-up windows saw an army that traveled with its own bakeries, its own laundries, and its own endless supply of fuel. The ideological foundation of the Nazi state was predicated on the idea that democracy was weak and inefficient. The sight of the American soldier, well-fed, warmly dressed, and casually tossing away items that a German family would have considered treasures, was a direct visual refutation of a decade of indoctrinated lies. The ersatz lifestyle was not a badge of honor. It was a symptom of a catastrophic failure, and the realization was beginning to dawn that the decadent West possessed a strength that the Reich could not even comprehend. The first encounter was not marked by a clash of steel, but by a profound, silent realization. As the dust of the American columns settled in the squares of captured German towns, the heavy cellar doors, once bolted against the expected brutality of barbaric occupiers, slowly creaked open. The women who emerged were ghosts of their former selves, wrapped in tattered wool and wearing the pale, translucent skin of the chronically malnourished. They moved with a cautious, bird-like fragility, their eyes darting between the massive, idling GMC trucks and the soldiers who lounged atop them. They had been prepared for execution or worse. They were not prepared for the casual, indifferent generosity of the American GI. From the tailgates of the supply trucks, the transformation began. A sergeant from Iowa, seeing a group of children and their hollow-cheeked mothers watching from a distance, reached into a wax-sealed box. He did not brandish a weapon or shout commands. Instead, he pulled out a loaf of bread. To the soldiers, this was a Pullman loaf, a standard-issue product of the massive mobile bakeries that trailed the front lines. To the German women, who had spent years sawing through loaves of Käsebrot that were more sawdust than flour, the object was unrecognizable. It was snow-white, impossibly airy, and smelled of pure, unadulterated wheat and sugar, a scent that had been scrubbed from the German memory by a decade of total war. The silence of the square was broken by the sound of a woman sobbing. As the sergeant tore the loaf and handed pieces to the outstretched, trembling hands, the emotional dam burst. These were women who had survived the firebombing of their cities and the loss of their husbands on the Eastern Front without a tear, yet they wept at the sight of white bread. It was a visceral, physical shock. The soft texture of the bread felt like cake in their mouths, a decadent luxury that shouldn't exist in a world at war. They touched the bread as if it were a holy relic, turning it over in their hands, marveling at the lack of grit, the absence of husks, and the sheer, pillowy lightness of it. In that moment, the ideological architecture of the Third Reich crumbled more effectively than any stone building. The Nazi Party had spent years insisting that the American economy was a shambles, that their people were starving, and that only the German spirit could sustain a nation through the trials of war. Yet here, in the middle of a ruined continent, was an army that possessed such a surplus of resources that their very bread was a miracle of refinement. The tears were not just for the food, they were for the realization of the massive, systematic lie they had lived. The American soldier wasn't just an occupier. He was a representative of a world that had so much to spare that even its basic military rations were a feast for the conquered. This was the first true fracture in the German psyche. The moment when the master race realized they had been outproduced, outfed, and fundamentally outclassed by the decadent democracy they had been taught to despise. The white bread of the U.S. Army was more than mere sustenance. It was a recurring symbolic object that represented the industrial and ideological might of American democracy. In the exhausted eyes of the German population, bread had always been a dark, dense, and increasingly scarce commodity, a physical reminder of the state's control over the very calories required to survive. The Nazi regime used bread as a tool of discipline, rationing it strictly and filling it with the grit of survival. To them, bread was a weapon of war. To the Americans, bread was a standardized, mass-produced miracle of the industrial age. The sheer scale of the American baking operation was a feat of engineering that defied the German understanding of military logistics. Behind the front lines of every division stood the Quartermaster Corps' mobile bakery companies. These units were not merely field kitchens. They were high-capacity factories on wheels, capable of producing tens of thousands of fresh loaves every single day. While the Wehrmacht struggled to find enough fodder for the horses that pulled their supply wagons, the Americans were deploying mechanized ovens that churned out uniform, sliced, and vitamin-fortified white bread. This bread was designed to be consistent, soft, and durable, a taste of the American home front transported across an ocean and through the fire of the Siegfried Line. The symbolism lay in the bread's color and texture. In a Europe that had been turned gray by coal dust, gunpowder, and starvation, the startling whiteness of the American loaf was an affront to the Nazi narrative. White bread, historically a mark of the aristocracy or of special occasions, was being handed out by ordinary American privates as if it were of no consequence. It represented a society so wealthy and so technologically advanced that even its lowest-ranking soldiers ate like kings compared to the master race. The bread was soft because the Americans possessed the sugar and fats that Germany had lost years ago. It was white because they had the luxury of refining their grain to a degree that was now impossible in the ruined Reich. Every slice handed through a truck window was a silent argument for the efficiency of a free society. The German people had been told that democracy was a chaotic, failing system that led only to poverty and disorder. Yet, the white bread proved otherwise. It was a product of a vast, coordinated network of Midwestern farmers, industrial millers, and efficient transporters, all working in harmony without the need for the brutal, coercive hunger plans of the Nazi state. This recurring symbol of American abundance became a psychological bridge. For the German civilian, eating the bread was the first act of participating in the post-war world. It was a sensory realization that the strength of a nation was not found in the austerity of its soldiers, but in the surplus of its citizens. The bread was the first taste of a new ideology, one where the state served the needs of the individual, rather than the individual being sacrificed for the glory of a starving empire. The emotional breaking point arrived not with the thunder of falling bombs, but in the silence of a shared meal. For the German civilian, the preceding years had been a grueling exercise in the suppression of emotion. Tears were a luxury they could not afford while navigating the ruins of their cities or standing in endless queues for a handful of gray potatoes. They had been hardened by the fire and the cold, yet they found themselves utterly defenseless against a simple gesture of American generosity. When the GIs reached into their packs and offered slices of that impossibly white bread, the stoic mask of the master race finally shattered. It was a visceral reaction that bypassed the intellect and struck directly at the soul. Documented accounts from the spring of 1945 describe scenes of mass weeping in the streets of towns like Aachen and Cologne. These were not the frantic, hysterical sobs of fear, but a profound, collective release of grief and realization. One woman, clutching a piece of the soft, yeasty bread, was seen falling to her knees, unable to process the fact that such a thing existed while her children were wasting away. The bread was a physical manifestation of everything they had been denied: purity, sweetness, and the security of a functioning world. The contrast was too stark to ignore. While the Nazi state had demanded total sacrifice for a promise of future glory that never arrived, the Americans were offering immediate, tangible comfort. The German people had been told that the Americans were a nation of gangsters and cowboys who lacked the capacity for true human feeling or cultural depth. Yet, these supposed barbarians were the ones providing the first real nourishment the civilians had tasted in years. The emotional shock was rooted in the sudden awareness of the betrayal they had suffered at the hands of their own leaders. They realized that they had been led into a desert of scarcity while the decadent enemy possessed an abundance that was almost divine in its scale. The soldiers themselves were often moved by the intensity of the reaction. Many young men from the American Midwest, who had never known a day of true hunger in their lives, watched in confusion and pity as grown women break down at the sight of a standard army ration. They saw the desperation in the way the children hovered near the tailgates, waiting for a crust of the white bread that the soldiers often took for granted. This interaction bridged the gap between occupier and occupied. The bread became a medium of communication where language failed. It spoke of a world that was moving beyond the darkness of total war and into a future defined by a different kind of power. The tears shed over the bread rations were the first drops in a rising tide of change, a signal that the old order was dead and that the German people were finally beginning to wake from a long, starving nightmare. The transformation of ideology was not a sudden, intellectual epiphany, but a slow, sensory realization that began in the gut and moved to the mind. For 12 years, the German people had been enclosed in a hermetically sealed chamber of indoctrination, told that the world outside was a decaying wasteland of failed systems and inferior races. They had been taught that the National Socialist way was the only path to a future of prosperity, and that the sacrifice of their civil liberties was a small price to pay for the security of the state. However, the physical reality of the American arrival, specifically the abundance of the white bread, shattered the glass of that chamber. When the German civilians tasted the soft, sweet grain of the American rations, they were tasting the failure of their own government. The master race narrative required a belief in the inherent weakness of democracy, yet here was a democratic army that was better fed, better clothed, and more efficiently organized than the Wehrmacht had ever been, even at its zenith. The ideology of the Reich was predicated on the will to power, a belief that spiritual toughness could overcome material reality. But as the women of the ruined Rhineland sat in their hollowed-out homes, chewing on the pillowy remnants of an American loaf, they realized that will could not manufacture calories, and spirit could not refine flour. This shift in perception was devastating. It stripped away the last vestiges of loyalty to a regime that had led them into a catastrophic desert. The realization dawned that the decadent Westerners had achieved through freedom and industry what the Germans had failed to achieve through conquest and terror. The white bread became a psychological weapon of immense power, proving that the American system produced a surplus of life, while the Nazi system produced only a surplus of death. The civilians began to look at the American soldiers not as monsters to be feared, but as representatives of a functional world they desperately wanted to join. This transformation went beyond mere hunger. It was the birth of a new political consciousness. The German people had been raised to believe that the state was the provider, the ultimate arbiter of who ate and who starved. Seeing the American soldiers casually hand out food without the need for a party card or a display of ideological purity suggested a different kind of relationship between the citizen and the government. It suggested that a nation's strength was measured by the well-being of its people, rather than the scale of its monuments or the reach of its borders. In the simple act of sharing a meal, the foundation for a democratic Germany was laid. The bread had done what the bombs could not. It had convinced the conquered that their conquerors possessed a truth worth adopting. The ideology of scarcity was dead, replaced by the startling, white promise of a world built on abundance and the dignity of the individual. The expectation of the German soldier had been forged in the fires of a scorched earth doctrine. They had been commanded to leave nothing but ash for the advancing, plutocratic hordes, under the assumption that the Americans were a fragile race who relied entirely on their overextended supply lines. The Wehrmacht soldier, retreating through his own shattered heartland, expected to find an enemy as desperate and brutalized as himself. He expected a vengeful victor who would strip the land of its last remaining seeds. What they actually experienced was a logistical phenomenon that defied their comprehension of warfare. While the German army had reverted to horse-drawn carts and scavenged turnip soup, the American soldier arrived as part of a motorized, self-sustaining civilization. The contrast was most visible in the interaction between the two forces. German prisoners of war, huddled in makeshift enclosures, watched with hollow eyes as American infantrymen tossed aside half-eaten cans of meat or white bread because they were bored with the flavor. To the German, who had been taught that waste was a capital offense against the state, this casual disregard for calories was a terrifying display of power. It signaled that the United States was not just fighting a war, but was operating at a level of industrial surplus that rendered the German will irrelevant. The German soldier realized that he wasn't just losing a battle of tactics. He was being overwhelmed by an economy that could afford to be generous while his own nation was starving in the rubble. The American soldier's reality was one of unimaginable luxury in the eyes of the conquered. While the German soldier had been promised glory and ended up with frostbite and sawdust bread, the American GI complained about the lack of fresh milk while sitting atop a truck filled with white, pillowy loaves and chocolate bars. This disparity in the basic experience of life on the front lines was the ultimate refutation of the Nazi racial hierarchy. The inferior Americans were the ones with the warm coats, the roaring engines, and the white bread, while the master race was reduced to begging for the scraps of a democracy's surplus. The experience shifted from a clash of ideologies to a confrontation with the undeniable truth that the free world was simply more capable of sustaining human life than the totalitarian one. This realization fundamentally altered the German soldier's perception of his own cause. The fanaticism that had sustained them through the Eastern Front began to evaporate when faced with the sheer material benevolence of the American logistical tale. It is documented that some German officers, upon seeing the contents of a captured American supply dump, realized the war had been lost years prior. They saw not just weapons, but crates of cigarettes, mountains of refined flour, and millions of gallons of fuel, items that had become mythical in the Reich. The American abundance was a psychological siege engine that battered down the last defenses of the German mind. The war was no longer about territory. It was about the realization that their entire system had been a monumental failure of imagination and production. The white bread was the final, soft, and sweet nail in the coffin of the Reich's military pride. The logistics of democracy were not merely a background function of the American war effort. They were the primary engine of its victory, a mathematical certainty that rendered the German will to power an obsolete concept. While the Third Reich's logistics were a desperate patchwork of horse-drawn carriages and plundered local stocks, the United States Quartermaster Corps operated on a scale of industrial precision that mirrored the assembly lines of Detroit. For every American division in the field, there were 7 tons of supplies arriving daily at the ports of Europe. This was the factual data of a nation that had mobilized its entire economy toward the singular goal of sustained, high-intensity warfare, ensuring that its soldiers, and eventually the civilians they encountered, were supported by a surplus of resources that no totalitarian state could match. The centerpiece of this logistical miracle was the Mobile Bakery Company. These units were staffed by specialized technicians who operated massive, gasoline-fired ovens capable of producing 4,000 pounds of bread in a single shift. By the time the Allied armies reached the Rhine, there were hundreds of these mobile units operating across the continent, churning out millions of loaves per week. This was not a primitive field kitchen setup. It was a sophisticated, standardized operation that utilized pre-mixed, vitamin-enriched flour, granulated sugar, and vegetable shortening, ingredients that were practically non-existent in the blocked and battered German economy. The sheer volume of this production allowed the American military to maintain a diet that provided over 4,000 calories per day to its frontline troops, a figure that stood in stark contrast to the 1,200 calories being scraped together by the average German civilian. As the American columns pushed deeper into the heart of Germany, this logistical tale transformed from a military asset into a tool of humanitarian intervention. The Quartermaster Corps began diverting thousands of tons of grain and refined flour to feed the starving populations of captured cities. In towns where the local bakers had long since run out of fuel and ingredients, American trucks arrived with pre-baked loaves and crates of flour that were cleaner and whiter than anything seen in Europe since 1939. This was the practical application of democratic industrialism, the ability to feed a conquered nation while simultaneously fueling a global war on 2 fronts. The German civilians, observing the endless stream of Red Ball Express trucks, realized they were witnessing a level of organizational competence that the Nazi state had always claimed for itself but never actually achieved. The data of American supply spoke of a world that was moving beyond the zero-sum game of conquest. In the Nazi worldview, For one to eat, another had to starve. In the American logistical model, the goal was to create enough for everyone. This was the fundamental lesson of the Quartermaster Corps, that a free economy, unburdened by the inefficiencies of ideological purity and the corruption of a single-party state, could produce a surplus that acted as a stabilizing force in the wake of total collapse. The white bread distributed from the tailgates of American trucks was the physical proof of this data, a tangible, edible record of a society that had mastered the art of abundance. It was the logistics of democracy that finally broke the German spirit, proving that the true master race was the one that could provide life as efficiently as it could wage war. The epilogue of this historical collapse is written in the soft, white crumbs of a new era. As the smoke cleared from the ruins of the thousand-year Reich, what remained was not the steel-hardened resolve of a master race, but a profound, quiet gratitude for the basic elements of life. The peace of bread had begun. It was a peace that was not negotiated in grand halls or signed with ornate pens, but one that was felt in the mouths and stomachs of a broken people. The simple act of eating a slice of white bread had become the most significant political event of their lives. It was the moment when the abstract promises of total war were replaced by the concrete reality of a functioning civilization. The tears shed in the streets of the Rhineland were the final echoes of a dying ideology. They represented the shedding of a decade of lies and the acceptance of a truth that was both humbling and liberating. The German people had been told that freedom was a weakness and that abundance was a symptom of decay. Yet, the white bread proved that freedom was the most powerful engine of production ever devised. It showed that a society built on the dignity of the individual could produce a surplus of grace even in the midst of total destruction. The bread was the first taste of a world where the state existed to serve the needs of the many, rather than the many being sacrificed for the vanity of the state. This transformation of the German soul was the true victory of the Western Allies. While the Red Army brought a different kind of darkness from the East, the Americans brought the light of industrial democracy, symbolized by a humble loaf of bread. It was a lesson in the power of generosity as a weapon of war. By feeding their enemies, the Americans did more than just sustain lives. They conquered the hearts and minds of a generation. They proved that the ultimate strength of a nation is not found in the caliber of its cannons, but in the quality of its grain and the willingness to share it. Looking back from the vantage point of a rebuilt and prosperous Europe, the image of the weeping German woman clutching a piece of American bread remains a hauntingly beautiful testament to the human spirit. It is a reminder that even in our darkest moments, the simplest gestures of humanity can spark a revolution of the heart. The white bread of 1945 was more than a ration. It was a promise. It was the promise that the nightmare was over and that a new world, one defined by liberty, abundance, and the quiet security of a shared meal, was finally beginning to rise from the ashes. In the end, it was not the fire of the bombs that changed the world, but the sweetness of the bread.